Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 2024 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors and partners that made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa City Public Library, Prairie Lights, where we currently are, Iowa Public Radio, the Graduate Hotel, and Think Iowa City. Support is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Iowa Arts Council, which exists within the Iowa Economic Development Authority. The vast majority of the book festival events are offered without charge, but they are not free. So please consider donating to the City of Literature by visiting iowacitybookfestival.org and clicking on support. Today, we will hear from author Nicolás Medina Mora. Nicolás Medina Mora was born and raised in Mexico City. He has degrees from Yale University and the writing program here at the University of Iowa, and has worked in New York City as a journalist at Reuters and BuzzFeed. His writing has appeared in The Nation, The New York Times, and N+1, where he won the 2023 N+1 Writers Fellowship for outstanding contributions. He currently lives in Mexico City, where he is a writer and editor for Revista Nexos. Now please welcome Nicolás Medina Mora, who will speak about his latest book, America del Norte.
Hello, thank you for coming. It's very nice to be here, and it means the world to me to read at Prairie Lights. When I was a student here, I came to a bunch of readings here, and it feels like like a rite of passage in some ways. So I'm very grateful that you all came for this. My novel, America del Norte, is fundamentally about the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's a joke, don't worry. But it's about the relationship between Mexico and the United States, and about history, and about how history shapes that relationship, and how that relationship and that history shapes individual lives or deforms them. Hence the name, right? It's about the continent, if you will. One of the things that this means is that it's actually kind of hard to read from this book because the structure is like very fragmentary and there's a bunch of different threads. So I've been told that I can, read for a little bit longer than I had been planning for, which is nice. So I'm gonna try to give you like a sampling. And to start, I'm gonna read from the very beginning, the prologue, which is kind of like, it's a prologue. It tells you what it's about. Entre las naciones como entre los amantes. Like the Spaniards before them, the Americans landed in Veracruz and marched west, away from the malarial fevers of the Tierra Caliente and up the jagged slopes of the Sierra Madre, past taciturn agaves and stern oyameles and the blinding snowcaps of half-asleep volcanoes, until they reached the high valley where the air was thin and clear and the white light of the autumn sun fell vertical and merciless on the ill-defended capital, casting angular shadows on the barricades where the remnants of an army of barefoot conscripts whiled away their final moments, dulling terror with liquor and gambling, gathering stones to throw when their obsolete muskets ran out of ammunition, not so much resolved as resigned to die in a futile stand against an enemy destined to rule the continent. The truth, however, is that none of it was fated. At the start of the 19th century, conflict between Mexico and America was likely, but not inevitable. The war that transformed the United States from an uneasy federation of small Atlantic republics into a global empire was but one of infinite possible outcomes: trusting coexistence grounded on commerce, friendship born from shared commitments to self-determination, even a gradual blurring of the lines that in due time could have brought about the death of two nation-states founded on genocide and slavery, and given birth to a North American commune. But history is the transmutation of contingency into necessity, and what need not happen did. In the cool hours before dawn on September 12, 1847, the artillerymen of the United States Army trained their howitzers on the last significant fortification between them and Mexico City, Chapultepec Castle, a stone complex atop a steep hill built as a manor that now housed a military academy. 16-inch rounds began falling on the walls adorned with ornate masonry, but offering scant cover. The 1,000 men of the garrison, among them cadets as young as 13, had no choice but to stand under fire for 12 hours, watching shrapnel tear and shred their friends. The following day, hundreds of U.S. Marines charged up the hill, taking cover behind venerable cypresses decorated with long hanging moss, dear alike to Cortés and Moctezuma. When they reached the parapet, they leaned siege ladders against the walls and began to climb in a swarm. At first, the Marines died in scores, their bodies stumbling on their brothers and dragging them to their deaths. But they were many, and their adversaries were few. By mid-morning, the defenders had been overrun. In the years after the battle was settled, the Mexican Republic would try to make sense of the humiliation it had suffered. The future had looked so promising just decades earlier, when New Spain broke free from its hemophiliac metropole to become one of the largest countries in the world, a vast realm rich in silver and in people that stretched from the forests of Oregon to the jungles of Darien. Now, however, Mexico City had been conquered a second time. How to look in the mirror, what to tell the young. The factual record offered no answers, and so the nation's patriotic scribes reached for myth, or rather for epic, a form where the beauty of heroism is enough to redeem defeat. The scribblers set out to find Hectors for their North American Troy, and found them in the cadets of Chapultepec. Over the course of countless retellings, the memory of the child soldiers underwent a process not unlike the one Freud describes in the interpretation of dreams. Truths too painful to contemplate became half-truths, which in turn became wish-fulfilling fantasies, which were then passed off as truths. The logic of history replaced the logic of literature replaced that of history. Nonfiction became fiction. Soon the central story Mexicans told about the war was the tale of a handful of boys who had fought out to the end, long after all hope was lost, retreating to the highest tower rather than surrendering with their older comrades. When the Marines reached the platform, the last surviving cadet tore the Mexican flag from its pole, wrapped it around his adolescent body, and leaped off the cliff. The dream work allowed Mexicans to convince themselves that the Americans had defeated them, not because they were worthier, but merely because they were stronger. But to believe one's fantasies is the definition of madness, and so perhaps it would behoove us to counter the epic tale of the heroic children with another tale, one taken from history rather than from dreams. A few weeks before the cadets of Chapultepec committed ritual suicide, a very different young Mexican arrived in Washington for a secret audience with the Secretary of State, James Buchanan, who would later become president. His mission was simple, if not easy: negotiate an informal agreement that would protect the interests of the Mexican aristocracy. The secret agent, Don Luciano Fernando Arteaga y Salazar, was the scion of an old family from Durango, a horse-breeding clan whose founder had received his hacienda in recognition of his services to Cortés. He had been sent to England at a young age to receive a proper education, then traveled the continent armed with letters of recommendation that introduced him to the best minds of the age. By the time he returned to Mexico, he had become something rarer and more dangerous than a cosmopolite, a translator. When it became obvious that the war was lost, the notables of Mexico City summoned Arteaga y Salazar to a private meeting at the country estate of the Archbishop's illegitimate son. They explained that while patriotic honor demanded that they continue to publicly support the war effort, the responsibility as unacknowledged stewards of the nation compelled them to look at things unsentimentally. The countless revolutions and counter-revolutions that had kept the country on fire ever since independence suggested that the people of Mexico were simply incapable of pursuing their own best interest. Reunion with Spain was not only impossible but also undesirable. The notables remembered the condescension with which their peninsular cousins had treated them. But the American invasion, perfidous as it was, offered an unexpected opportunity. And so Arteaga y Salazar assumed a false name and sailed from Campeche to Philadelphia, where he made contact with American agents. On that day in September, however, almost nobody in Mexico City knew of the young translator and his secret mission. After the fall of Chapultepec, the surviving Mexican forces fought on throughout the day, putting up fierce resistance near San Cosme. But then, at nightfall, the Americans fired artillery shells on the crowded city center. The Mexican commander-in-chief, Don Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, that one-legged Simon Bolivar impersonator, gathered the dregs of his army and quietly abandoned the capital, declaring that he hoped to spare its inhabitants a week of house-to-house butchery followed by nights of looting and rape. It was only much later that the people of Mexico learned that Santa Anna's retreat had nothing to do with protecting the innocent, and everything to do with the agreement Alcalde Salazar had brokered in Washington. At dawn of September 14, the Americans marched into Mexico City. Terrified of ambushes, they advanced in perfect silence, surprised to encounter no resistance. As rumors spread, crowds gathered on rooftops to watch the ghostly procession of the conquerors. When his troops had secured the central plaza, the Zócalo, General Winfield Scott, known to favor fuss and feathers, dressed in parade uniform and mounted a handsome white horse, hoping to cut a fine stamp on his entrada. He rode onto the square, where he supervised the raising of the stars and stripes and reviewed his triumphant ranks as they broke into a spontaneous rendition of Yankee Doodle. The corporal general took possession of the National Palace and climbed to the balcony to address his troops and the people they had conquered. He had just begun a pompous speech when a group of women who had gathered in the plaza interrupted him with heckles. "Cállate, puerco!" Then a shot went off from some high window, wounding a U.S. officer in the leg. The Americans turned their cannon on the crowd and opened fire with grape-shot munitions. When news of the victory reached Washington, the American Republic debated just how much land to annex. Some rallied behind the cry of all of Mexico, arguing with the governor of Virginia that slavery should pour itself abroad without restraint and find no limit but the Southern Ocean. But in the end, the rulers of the newborn empire decided to keep only the northern half of the country they had conquered. The reasons, in the words of one Senator Calhoun, Democrat of South Carolina, were straightforward. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race, for more than half of the Mexicans are Indians. I protest against such a union as that. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race. The great misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these colored races on equality with the white race. The dream of a united North America was forever lost. The two nations were never joined, neither in marriage nor by conquest, and instead remained divided by a line, so thin as to be invisible, so stark as to be impassable, that cut not just across the land, but also through the heart. It should come as no surprise that love between their children became impossible. So that's the prologue.
Wow.
Thank you. The protagonist of the novel is a descendant of this translator, and he is a student at the Iowa Nonfiction program. And he has just attended a reading at Prairie, where a fellow who is an alum of the program and also a former border patrolman has given a reading, of his memoir called The Patrolman and the Penitent. This is completely fictional, of course. Que iban los dorados. The alumnus stood silent for a moment, making eye contact with members of the audience, holding the expression of a college theater Hamlet. Then he closed the book with a clap and smiled like a priest telling his congregants they could go in peace. The crowd exploded in applause. I sank into my chair and looked for Mayeli. She barely came to workshop anymore, let alone to optional but highly encouraged events. Every so often, I would run into her at Dave's Foxhead Tavern, usually on weekdays, usually in the early afternoon, but also with increasing frequency in the mid-morning, when I would head to the bar in hopes of hastening the end of another empty day by means of a self-aware filtration with functional alcoholism, only to find her sitting by herself on a corner stool at the edge of the bar, nursing a beer, staring out of the grime-slicked window, dying of nostalgia. And nodding greeting, and she'd nod back but not look at me, so I would order a PBR and arrive from the hostile barkeep and head to one of the booths near the back, where I couldn't see her, and she couldn't see me. I would open my book and pretend to read, holding on to the thought that, even if we couldn't be friends, we could at least sit at the Foxhead, alone, and yet together. But moments later, I would hear her settle her tab and walk out of the bar. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I was reminded that I was sitting under the true bright fluorescent lamps of Prairie's bookstore, surrounded by people I most certainly didn't want them to think I was vulnerable to solipsism. I looked up and saw the smiling face of the youngest member of my cohort, a delightful kid from a rusty town in Michigan who wrote about Batman and It Follows and always shared his cigarettes and kept inviting me to play disc golf and who often made me wonder whether the problem wasn't the Foss City, that's Iowa, the program, my classmates, but rather myself. Hey, sad boy, he said. All good? We've been yelling your name for a hot minute. Some of us are going to the Fox with the man of the hour. Wanna come? I should go home. And do what? Listen to the National? We stood around for a while, making small talk while the alumnus finished fake laughing with the head of the poetry workshop. Then we headed downstairs and onto the street and towards the Foxhead. All the while, my classmates heaped praise on the alumnus, the power of his prose and his performance, the courage he had shown by taking on such an urgent task at such great moral risk. It was a shame that some people couldn't see that. They had heard about, how to call them, the disruptions during his readings. And honestly, maybe it wasn't their place because the people behind the disruptions were for the most part Latinx, whereas they were white. But somebody had to say it. It was unfair that people who hadn't even read his book felt they had the right, or like the obligation, to silence his voice. We sat down at a booth in the bar. Thank you, the alumnus said. I know it's coming from a place of solidarity, and that means a lot. Because, I'm not gonna lie, it has been hard. At the same time, I'm okay with it. The folks who interrupt my events have every right to be mad. That's what the book is about. The immigration system is a dehumanization machine. And shit, I was part of that machine for nearly 6 years. And I know the fact that I wrote a book about what I saw doesn't erase what I did. I used to think it did, or at least hope so. But I was wrong, because, like, what right do I have to say anything about this shit? But I guess after a while, I started to question if keeping quiet out of shame wasn't just another way to avoid it. Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe I had a duty to speak out, to testify on what I saw, and to do it from that place of shame. But before I could do that, I had to prove my commitment to my readers, sure, but mainly to the migrants, and also to myself. And shit, I don't know, maybe even to God. I wouldn't call myself a Christian, but honestly, you can't spend a lot of time working in or around immigration without noticing that what goes down by the border sure as hell looks a lot like the Bible. There was a pause in the conversation. I wonder if anybody would ask the obvious question, but a moment passed and nobody spoke. So you stayed in the border patrol for all of 6 years? I finally said. The alumnus turned to look at me in the eye. Almost 20% of my fucking life. Look at that, said the delightful kid from Michigan. We are down to our strategic beer reserves. Sebas gave me a hand. Sebas, the protagonist. I got up from the table and walked over to the bar with him. Kinda cringe, right? He said while we waited for the pictures. Or rather cringe. I was worried I was the only snake on the plane. It's a cringe fest, a cringe nibble, a Beirut of cringe. Never mind. You and I don't belong to the same reptilian species. Thanks for diffusing. No problem, sad boy, but play nice. Last thing we need is the program's large adult son complaining to the faculty about how rude we were to him. By the time we made it back to the table, the conversation had moved on to the leitmotifs of the Iowa of those years. The challenge of navigating intersecting vectors of bidirectional oppression of a white supremacist society, the nonfiction writing program's second child syndrome is the fiction and poetry workshops, the importance of decolonizing the canon, the classroom, and most importantly, the cardiac chamber. I listened in silence, hurrying through rounds of rye, increasingly plastered and increasingly annoyed. After some time, I went to take a piss, and on the way back, I stopped by the jukebox, a Precambrian machine that played CDs filled with idiosyncratic mixtapes of pirated music. I fed it a quarter, flipped mindlessly through the mechanical menu, chose the first track I recognized, LCD Systems, Dance Yourself Clean, and returned to my seat. Soon a vaguely tropical loop of percussion samples filled the room. A throbbing synth bass growled through the speakers. Bass? Well, English. Growing synth bass growled through the speakers on the first beat of each bar, rattling the bottles behind the counter. Then the vocal track came in, and I realized with horror that I had been the one who blew his cover because I was enjoying it, wasn't I? I was getting a kick, a smug little hit of dopamine from the devious pleasure of gathering yet more evidence for the proposition that I was better than these Americans. I felt a wave of disgust at myself, but the self-hatred only made the kick hit harder. Who knew resentment could feel so good? To my disappointment, however, nobody at the table seemed to realize what had just happened. By then, the delightful kid and most of my classmates had go home. The only people left at the table were the pseudo-anthropologists who had given dysentery to a bunch of Guatemalan villagers. That happened. The canonizer, a living white girl who didn't care about dead white males, and the alumnus, who was clearly going to sleep with either of them, although preferably with the decanonizer. Don't get me wrong, said the alumnus. It's obviously terrible and terrifying. At the same time, maybe it's what we need, to wake up, to shake things up. Maybe shit has to get worse before it can get better. This is happening shortly after Trump got elected. Fuck yeah, said the pseudo-anthropologist. That's what I always say to the Mensheviks at the grad student union meetings. We can't just sit around waiting for the revolution to happen on its own. Plus, the alumnus went on, looking for the canonizer, as the pseudo-anthropologist had never spoken, worst comes to worst, like at the very least, it's gonna make art punk again. At that point, they couldn't hold it anymore and burst out laughing. Right, said the alumnus. I guess it's all really funny, but isn't it? Fascism, fucking hilarious. But to be honest, brother, I don't get the joke. I waved my hand apologetically, trying to contain the spasms of hilarity. I'm sorry, I said when I finally managed to stop laughing. I'm not making light of it. It's just, well, not gonna lie, you're starting to sound like someone who doesn't stand to lose much from how to call it, this necessary tragedy, this wake-up call, this valiant effort at cranking up the dialectical locomotive. Because guess what, baby? That song and dance about the emergency brake? Fucking revisionist heresy. This is a world historical rocket ship, honey boo, and it's either shoulder to the wheel or back against the... Dude, that's bullshit, that the canonizer said. Nothing to lose? Buddy, maybe this is news to you, but I have a uterus and like 200 grand in student debt. Besides, guess what? Some of my best friends are Latina. Actually, one of them is undocumented, and I fucking resent the suggestion that... Do you mean Mayeli? What? No, but so what if I did? Mayeli's an American citizen. Look, boss, you need to check your privilege, okay? Because you don't know shit about me. Got it? I'm sincerely sorry, I said insincerely. But there's been a misunderstanding. I never said you sounded like someone who had nothing to lose, only that he did. That's even worse, the canonizer said. He is fucking Mexican. Oh, don't worry. He's made sure it's impossible to forget that. You're being a jerk, Sebastian. Sebastian. Sorry? Stress on the last syllable, s'il vous plaît. The alumnus set his glass on the table, slightly louder than necessary. All right, compadre. You've had too much to drink and you're starting to say things you don't mean. Time to go home. Fine, but can I ask you a question before I go? Homie, you're making a fool of yourself. Why Emiliano? What? Your name. Why do you pick Emiliano as opposed to, I don't know, Maximiliano? Listen, brother, so far you've been getting friendly advice, but keep it up and you might get something else. Was it because of Emiliano Zapata? What the fuck? Who the fuck are you to gatekeep Latinidad, pendejo? It's just so basic, don't you think? The alumnus threw his beer in my face. It's my abuelo's name, asshole. Okay, sure, I said. I stood up, drops of lukewarm lager dripping down my hair and onto my glasses. But did Gramps fight with El Ejército del Sur? Get the fuck out of here before I give you a puteriza, vato. I took off my glasses and wiped them on my shirt. Putiza, I whispered as I put them back on. What the fuck did you say? The noun you're looking for is putiza. Or alternatively, madriza. But never puteriza. Nobody has ever said puteriza, unless it's some northern Mexican thing, but even then it would still be incorrect because, as Jose Vasconcelos famously quipped, civilization ends where carne asada begins. The alumnus slapped me across the face. I laughed and took a vow for the decanonizer and shut myself out. Okay. And then thank you. There's a lot of other stuff. There's stuff about a mother who's dying, about the political downfall of a father. There's lots of histories and whatnot. And at the end, there's a poem, or it used to be a poem, and then my editor and agent were like, you know, your book is already pretty weird. Maybe you should put it in prose. But I began writing it at the class of one of my teachers here, Robin Schiff, who taught a class on the long poem. And anyway, it's kind of weird, but I've never actually gotten to do this because when I was in my book tour, I was told that, you know, keep to 5 minutes. Anyway, here it goes. It's called Canta y no llores. I'm only going to do the first half. In the year of the comets, so called because during its antique course, certain inexplicable events exposed the fraudulent astrology of the methods for the anticipation of the future on which I and many of my generation had been encouraged to rely, while we assess the advantages and risks of the various paths that opened before us as the measurable result of the interplay between the spirit of the times and the cards we had been dealt, by which we, or perhaps just I, meant our gender and our race, our class and caste, our family's past, the letters of our name, our place and date of birth, the relative location of the stars at such and such a time, and all the ruling signs that set the course of mortal life, which cards, in my case, amounted to the best and most auspicious hand dealt to any child born in Mexico at the dawn of the end of the last century, in a different world than 20 and 7 years before that moment, on that night, the 1st of July, which month in the valley of Anahuac is always the season of storms, but also, from time to time, the season of portents and elections, when I, having been tasked in my capacity as your Imperial Mercy's most foreign correspondent, producing a true and veridical account of some of the curious events which in those days were transpiring in my country, walked out of my father's house, where there was sorrow in the air, and headed to the center of the city. In the course of which advance I was surprised to find the streets so empty and quiet that I began to worry that something was amiss, which impression only grew after I reached an intersection and waited for the light and looked up and saw the Virgin on a billboard. And next to her, in bold, illuminated letters designed to be seen from afar, the phrase, "Pray for the motherland." But as I kept advancing, I came to see that on the night of an election when the left-wing opposition has defeated a regime of melancholic oligarchs, silence was no omen of disaster, but the sound of power changing hands without a single shot, the spacious echo of the clash between the future and the past in which the present is destroyed. And as I left La Roma and stepped onto La Juarez, I began to see people in increasing numbers. And by the time I reached Reforma, I was surrounded by a crowd, carrying drums and vuvuzuelas, chanting soccer cheers and slanted rhymes, and joking and laughing as if they were going to the fair, or as if the lottery tickets which they bought year after year on the birthdays of their mothers had all been drawn at once and made them eligible for a sum not large enough to change their lives, but good enough to brighten this moment on this night. And as these thoughts coursed through my head, I saw a large group of middle-aged queer folks, some dressed in drag, others very formally, others trying their best to pass unnoticed, walking leisurely downtown. And I decided to join them as they marched past grand hotels and statues of revolutionaries and missionaries, some of which still bore traces of the blood-red paint, with which some might have tagged it with the number 43 during the protests that followed the night of Iguala. I happened to be in town for one of them, and since my friends were going, I too went. And I remember marching under the brown fog of a winter dawn amid contingents of students in tight jeans and thick-rimmed glasses, carrying Mexican flags in which the green of hope and the red of blood had been replaced with morning black, and militant campesinos, men and women of all ages with dark skin made darker by the sun, their faces tense with a cold and silent rage that they seemed to have had close for years, or maybe decades, their right hands raised in a fist, and in each fist the terrifying incandescence of a machete in the sun. And I remember the line of federal police in riot gear, which in the Mexico of those years meant helmets with mirror visors, tear gas cannons, billy clubs, and tall and narrow shields that made me think of Roman legionaries, as they are sometimes depicted in the crucifixion scenes that penitent house painters probably still paint on the walls of certain churches in certain corners of the city. And all at once I was again in Baltimore on the uprising second night, wearing a press pass and a gas mask, clutching a notebook and chewing old gum, next to the ruins that still smolder under the blue and red lights of the state. And again I was surrounded by a crowd of young black folk who raised their palms as if to pray and called hands up and answered, "Don't shoot," while an older white man stood on a crate nearby, preaching the end of the world. "Some of you will die tonight," in a cold and bitter voice. And again I felt the breeze of the helicopters flying low and tracing methodical orbits with their searchlights, while a high-ranking officer of the Baltimore police stood on an armored truck like daft drudging president stands on a tank, behind a phalanx of riot cops who carried those same legionary shields, yelling orders through a loudspeaker. "The curfew begins in 10 minutes. Everyone has to leave." And again the hour struck, and again everyone was quiet, and again the cops began to beat their shields with their batons, keeping a slow and steady rhythm. And again someone threw a plastic bottle, still half filled with coke, which landed on a shield with an underwhelming thud, and bounced and rolled back to the center of the street, where it came to rest halfway between the people and the state. And again I saw the first bomb burst, like a portent in the air, or like the rocket's red glare, over the darkened ramparts of the fort that stood 5 miles away and a million years in the past. And again there was smoke and coughing and the sound of rushing footsteps, and the thought of rubber bullets and a stinging in the eyes which lasted until morning, which felt like a long time, but which nonetheless fell shorter than the minute when I stood before the people who had guarded me as a child, and I felt the chill of terror in the bottom of my spine. Because who was to say they wouldn't open fire on the men and women with machetes, or on the black-clad college students carrying Coke bottles, which in Mexico are made of glass, filled with a liquid that looked a lot like gasoline. But instead the city fell so silent that in the distance I could hear the mournful dissonances of the street organs. And it was then, all of a sudden, all at once, that thousands of people began to count. And they kept counting and counting, for a very long time, until they reached the number of the dead. And when the crowd had finished counting, a new chant began, Justicia y castigo a los culpables. And once again I shivered, because I understood too well that when they said the culpable, they meant the state, which is to say they meant the elite, which is to say they meant my father, which is to say they meant me. But then we got to the Alameda and waited for history to start again, until at last the screens that the victorious campaign had set out in the park got to a shot of a lectern on the ballroom. And then the leader stepped on stage. And then the crowd went hoarse. And then Lopez Obrador waved and waited like a father waits, until the cheers died out. And then the microphone captured the sound of the last breath before the plunge. And then he began to speak. Today is a historic day. Today we begin the fourth transformation. And as I listened with attention, I had a distinct impression. I heard the voice of Jose Vasconcelos. But as I turned to leave, a group of young musicians passed me, a tuba and an accordion, and a guitar and a drum, which on that very instant, as if the universe had folded on itself according to a symmetry that I, at least, associate only with geometry and with dreams, began to play a simple waltz. And before long, the crowd became a chorus hoarse from cheering, composed of fatalistic people who had put aside their fatalism in that moment, on that night, to sing without irony, a song about singing without irony. From the Sierra Morena, my little darling, they come descending. Two little night black eyes, my little darling, a smuggled present. Ay, 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 sing and don't cry, for bitter hearts grow less bitter, my little darling, when they go singing. It goes on, but let's just stop there. Thank you.
If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you. First of all, I would like to know if you wrote that with the same fantastic momentum with which you read it.
Well, I wrote it very quickly in like a manic state because my world was falling apart and I was trying to make sense of it. But yes, wouldn't recommend it, but I'm glad that if something nice came out of it because I like it. But yeah, it was awful. I try to avoid getting caught in geopolitical currents if you can.
So while I was reading the book, I was wondering at various parts why this wasn't like a memoir or instead of a fiction. But then when you kept talking about history and how things that did not happen are presented as historical fact and as like nonfiction, I didn't know if the choice to make this fiction was kind of a comment on that, or was this a nonfiction book at any point in time?
Yes, it began as my thesis of the nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa, that my friend John Dagada, who's in the back, was kind enough to direct. And the thing is, in the nonfiction program here, one of the tenets, at least when I was a student, is that what separates the essay from other kinds of nonfiction is that it can include things that are not facts, right? And I love that idea. And then I figured out that for myself, what I wanted to do was the opposite. I wanted to write fiction that included essays. And also, there's like this French literary theorist, Philippe Lejeune, who has a book called The Autobiographical Contract, where he says that what makes a memoir is that there's an implicit contract between the writer and the reader, where the former swears to tell the truth about the history of their personality. And I wanted not to tell the truth. I wanted to lie through my teeth. Yeah, I don't know. But yes, it's a book that began as a nonfiction project and then became fiction. Yeah, I don't know if that's answered.
Yeah.
So I'm a writer as well, and I find myself writing a lot about our culture and history and all of that. And I was just wondering how you balance writing about those dark horrors in our history, as well as keeping your mental health well, especially coming from a culture that mental health hasn't always been important in.
Yeah, well, I mean, how do I balance mental health? I began the book at a time where like I was like really, really unraveling, right? But most of like the actual revision and where most of the work happened after I had like returned to Mexico and kind of like settled. And so what's interesting actually was that what was difficult was that I constantly had to put myself in that emotional place over and over to write it, right? But you know, I also yeah, at one point I had psychotic break and everything. It was bad. But you know, like then I actually think that at least in Mexico City, mental health is like an important thing, but it's a different kind of approach, right? Like everybody's in psychoanalysis, right? I go like see a Lacanian witch doctor 3 times a week, right? And then you know, like I lay down for a variable amount of time, and then he says no, make incomprehensible shit, and somehow it's helpful. So yes, would not recommend your world unraveling. Definitely would recommend Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's not for everyone, but it's for some people, and it's amazing. So yes, time and analysis. That's I think the recipe. Yes.
What author do you like? Obviously, you read Spanish and English
Yes.
and maybe French.
Yes.
So who are the writers you like?
Sure.
And what are specific works
Absolutely.
you find interesting?
So I can give you like 3 novels in those 3 languages, which are the ones in which I read. In Spanish, Fernanda Melchor, Mlchor. She's wonderful. Hurricane Season. It's, I think, an incredibly important novel that everybody should read. There's a very good translation into English by Sophie Hughes. Even if you can read in Spanish, even better. In English, I recently reviewed and loved Rachel Kushner's new novel, Creation Lake. It's incredible, and it's like so good that, you know, you read it. And, you know, it's in some ways nice to know that like the novel that I'm trying to write and that I began writing before I read the book is actually kind of like similar, because it's like, well, I was onto something, and now you know, Rachel Kushner has gone and done it better than I ever could, and I will have to do something slightly different. That one's great. It's going to win the Pulitzer and the National Book Award and the Booker and the Nobel and whatever it is they give out in Japan. Mark my words, you heard it here first. And in French, I think like the latest book that I like was, you know, really taken with in French is Mohamed Sarr, La plus recondite mémoire des hommes, the most recondite memory of men. I won the Goncourt a couple of years ago. It's a novel by a Senegalese writer that has like been clearly reading a lot of Roberto Bolaño, and it's a tale of a number of West African and Congolese writers who are Francophone writers. They're working in French in France, and they're like looking for this mythical other writer who wrote one incredible book and then disappeared mysteriously. It's incredible. It has sex scenes that are actually hot, which is so hard. Yeah, those 3.
When you write a book with so much political and cultural content, there's got to be some concern about how it will be received. I just
Right.
wondered if you could tell us about what that experience has been for you.
Well, sure. Nobody has read it in Mexico, but everybody hates me. I got super canceled, not even because anybody read it, but because, you know, they looked at the cover and the dust jacket, and they decided that I, like, you know, was a reactionary and you know, like just the worst person ever. It was awful, but you know, it's fine. Like, they're allowed to like hate a book that they haven't read, and you know, they're a bunch of fucking Philistines and Neanderthals. But yeah, no, it's I think like part of the, you know, the risk that one runs, which is you know, to not shy away from political questions, and not only that, but also not shy away from like the obvious political answers, right? There's like a lot of critiques of the book of, you know, I think that the book begins with an epigraph from Louis Althusser, right? I would like to think that it's a book that is actually Marxist in orientation. It's a book about the material conditions, if you will, and about like the determinant power of history. And in a sense, that is also, it's a critique of certain approaches to leftism that, like, I think in the United States and increasingly in Mexico, lose track of the fact that actually the central question is who has money, who doesn't, right? The class is like not the only thing that matters. Obviously, the book is about caste, the book is about gender in some senses. But I think that yeah, if you write a book where you, like, you know, kind of like are willing to put yourself in the position of somebody who is like unconvinced by like the Latinidad of a former border patrolman, and who, you know, is kind of like, you don't even speak Spanish, my friend. And like, you know, why are you so attached to this Mexican identity where you're like also slashing water balls in the desert and leaving people to die, right? Like, I don't care that you're Mexican. I care that you are committing crimes, right, against the most vulnerable people on the continent. And if you do that, you are going to step into a bunch of into hot water, and people might be mad, as I learned. I didn't think they were going to be quite so mad. And I think the key is to sort of you know to not be scared of that, and to write the books that you want to write, and not really be concerned about how they are received, as far as it's possible. The new one that I'm writing is also very political, and I am trying to like be very mindful as to like how to play with like different kinds of ambiguity and different kinds of irony, while at the same time telegraphing the politics of the book very clearly. I think I'm beginning to see how it could work, but I'm not entirely sure. I have the great fortune of having a number of very brilliant friends who are, interlocutors in this, and whose ideas and whose warnings are incredibly valuable. And I think that that's something that I'm doing different this time. I'm trying to write a book that where I'm in conversation politically people, because this book was born from mostly literary conversations. I think that if I want to write the kind of fiction that I want to write, which is political fiction, or fiction that is concerned with politics, not that there's really a distinction, then yeah, maybe like things to think about it like more intentionally in terms of the politics, if that makes sense. This might be a little bit vague, but it's the best answer I can give you.
Right, well, it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time also. Other questions?
Hi, Nico. Thanks for reading
Hey,
that.
Mauricio.
That prologue is amazing.
Thanks, man.
That's amazing.
Muchas gracias.
So I have a question. I don't know when you were drafting and revising your novel. I was wondering if at that point the book American Dirt came out here in the US. If you were done with the revision, or if you were still revising your book, whether that discussion happening here in the US influenced this book or had nothing to do with it at all?
Well, I reviewed American Dirt for the magazine where I work, Nexos, and then N+1 published an English translation of my review. And like the critique was, one that actually another writer who comes to read a Prairie in the novel says, which is, the problem is not that people are writing about things that they haven't experienced. The problem is people who are writing about things that they don't know about, right? And I think that like the problem with American Dirt is that it's the work of somebody who clearly doesn't know very much about Mexico, and yet adopts a kind of a didactic voice about Mexico. I think anybody, I could not care less about whether the author of American Dirt is or not a Latina, right? What I do care about is that she, for instance, has her protagonist, who is, like ends up riding the beast, right? Like the train that like the most vulnerable migrants ride. She goes to the bank and withdraws 200,000 pesos, which is enough to put her in the like 95th percentile of income in the country. How does it make sense that like somebody who has that amount of money ends up taking that route, right? It's just completely implausible. There's like, a narco guy who's like obsessed with Garcia Marquez, which is okay, maybe, but he reads, it's like he reads it in English. And it's like, can you imagine like a fucking Sinaloa cartel guy who not only reads Garcia Marquez, but reads it in English? El Chapo Guzman famously is literate, right? And so yeah, but to tell the truth, like, I read the novel, I made fun of it, and then I like couldn't care less. I don't really think it influenced very much my novel, right? There's definitely like novels and books that came out that are in some ways related to Mexico that informed this. They're parodying the novel, but also the characters who are in the novel are just fake characters. They're fictional, right? Like they're not actually the people who wrote those books. But there's definitely, but American Dirt is not one of them. I just don't think it's actually that interesting. I think there's more interesting books that play on that thing. I also say, like having now been through the experience of a lot of people really disliking your book without having read it, I have acquired a newfound compassion for people who are put through a ringer. So yeah, watch what you tweet, or don't tweet at all, or I don't know, maybe read the books before you tweet about them. Who knows? Yeah.
Do you have other writers or special readers that work with you to workshop, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, like okay, so the new novel that I'm writing is like, about a group of people who are based on some of my friends. And what I have decided to do is just, let them read it throughout the whole process and like ask for their input and ideas, and like, it's like, it's in the early stages, but like, I really like what's coming out. It's very different from like workshopping, right? Because in the workshop, you show up and, you give your writing to a bunch of people with whom you have incredibly intense relationships that are often transferential, as they would say in psychoanalysis, and, messy and tangled. And, it's a very productive experience in some ways. But this is very different. Here, it's not, we're kind of like talking in, like the fact that like the central communal right of graduate students in writing here is like the weekly vivisection of their art by like their friends, lovers, frenemies, former friends, former lovers, former frenemies, catastrophic, right? And this is very different. This is, sort of like, okay, so like the character based on me, like would never do this. And you're like, you're totally right, actually. And then becomes a more interesting character, right? Or like, what are like, like okay, but like, how are you gonna make sure that like where you're writing doesn't sound like you're like making fun or critiquing the like fake socialist president of Mexico that you're like positing? Like that is like a very different kind of dialogue, right? And I don't think it's like, I mean, the workshop has its place, and I'm very glad that I like spent, a few years here at the nonfiction program doing that. But this is a different thing. This is just kind of like, almost like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Honestly, it's like the closest thing that I can think of, where like you kind of like set it up, and then like they roll the dice until they pick who their characters are and whatnot. I don't know. We'll see. It's kind of like half baked, and I haven't theorized it, but it's very exciting for me at least.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm curious about, you mentioned some Mexican books came out around the time that you were writing. What books do you feel that yours is in conversation with, or which books sort of influenced you?
Well, I mean, like the books that influenced me the most didn't come out when I was writing it. There's many of them. What are some examples of things that like were really formative in some ways? Well, obviously Bolaño, right? He's extraordinary and like world historical. The structure of the book owes a lot to the Savage Detectives. And the Savage Detectives in turn owes a lot to Where the Air is Clear, Carlos Fuentes' first novel. This kind of like notion of polyphony, this inclusion of history within a fictional narrative, this interest in class and in kind of like social distinction. Those are kind of like, I think, of the Latin American books that, and Melchor, obviously, I mean, more in terms of the prose than actually the structure. Other books that were like important for this, oh, there's just like so many. It's actually the hardest question that you can ask anybody. It's kind of like, but yeah, I don't know. Like there's, I guess like the tradition of the book in some ways is kind of like, it comes from high modernism as I see it, right? Like, there's Ezra Pound, again, I'm sorry, detestable fellow. Yes. Bad guy, bad. But he had this notion of the poem with history, not a poem about history, a poem with history, right? That was also very important to me. I think his politics are loathsome. He's awful. But it's also just extremely exciting to think that you could just have a text that is actually composed of an interweaving of different texts, right? Like in the novel, there's giant chunks of translated text from like 17th century astrology, right? There's a brief history of the conquest of Mexico written in the voice of a 17th century colonial aristocrat. There's a lot of like chunks of like 20th century essays by Alfonso Reyes, right? This notion of kind of like quoting at length. I think like that spirit I associate with high modernism, and like with like its various kind of like derivations from there. Balzac, frankly, again, the notion of the novel as fundamentally being concerned with class, right? Don Quixote and Cervantes, Borges, obviously. The notion that like the memory between life and literature is permeable, right? Jeffrey Lawrence, who's a literary critic at Rutgers, wrote a book about the dialogues between North and Latin America in literature in 20th century. And he says that like what makes American literature most distinct is that it's literature about experience, whereas the literature of Latin America is literature about literature. And one way you can see this is compare, for instance, the way that Kerouac treats the habits of reading of the characters of his novels versus how Bolaño treats the habits of readings of the characters in his novels. The Beats never read. They sometimes mention Nietzsche and sometimes say like really stupid shit about like Buddhist texts, right? But they're too busy living. And the Savage Detectives do nothing but talk about the books that they like and hate, right? Like it's literally like they exist to read. And that puts them in the lineage of Don Quixote, who is also a guy who's mostly just gone crazy because he's read too much, right? And so I think that what I wanted to do in some ways was to kind of like clash these two things. And so there's aspects of the book that are obviously indebted to American autofiction. Ben Lerner is clearly a huge influence in it. Makes me incredibly anxious that he has been so influential. And, you know, like on the other side, you have like, you know, weird neo-Baroque, like avant-garde Latin American stuff. And it's mostly about reading, right? It's a book about readers. And I think what I wanted to do was to make those two things clash, because I think that's what North America is, America del Norte, right? The collapse of like these two timelines. Yeah, is that a good answer? I'm sorry. That'd be great.
Right, do we have any more questions? I was gonna ask you, just kind of, I was gonna invite you to say what you'd like in closing, but I was curious what the publication process was like for you and what it was like working with the publisher.
Sure. So, you know, I graduated from the nonfiction program a semester early because my mother was dying and I wasn't gonna get a green card, and I moved back to Mexico. And then I spent, you know, had this thesis, which was, you know, about like, I don't know, 1/4 of the length. And it was mostly just the history, the autobiographical part, with, you know, quotation marks, was not there really. It was very strange, much more radical collage of like vignettes. And then I showed it to a literary agent who became my literary agent, Elias Altman, who is wonderful. And he said like, yeah, this is great, but, you know, I don't know what's going on. Like, can you like try to like, you know, find something that we can hold on to? And gradually that's when it became a novel, right? Like there had to be some kind of arc to link all of these vignettes together. And so in a way, you know, like the vignettes, sometimes some readers seem to, the historical vignettes, some readers seem to kind of like encounter them as sort of like ornament on top of the autobiographical story, but it's actually the other way around. The autobiographical story is an excuse to hang all of these vignettes from it. It's sort of like the skeleton only. It's also important, don't get me wrong, right? It achieves this thing of like the clash between literature of experience and literature of literature, or meta literature. And then, you know, I worked on it for a year, and then I showed it again to the agent. He's like, yeah, great, I'm gonna represent you. I think it's an important work of art. I was kind of like, yes, you know, before you know it, I'm gonna win the Nobel Prize. And then we submitted it to a total of, well, you know, we did a round of submission. People were like, yeah, this is interesting and weird, but no. And then it's like, well, you know, go back to the drawing board, work on it more. I worked on it for 2 more years. And then we sent it to a bunch of other publishing houses, and it got rejected in total by 17. And then 2 wanted it. And one of them, the editor was like, on our first meeting, it's kind of like, I think it's a great novel about Latinidad. And I'm like, oh no, it isn't. It's about how Latinidad doesn't exist. And then the other guy was the person that I wound up working with, who is a mad genius called Mark Doughton. He's a wonderful novelist. You should all check out Trump Sky Alpha. He's a second book, which opens with Donald Trump flying Zeppelin, a blimp, over a world devastated by nuclear war, broadcasting YouTube to no one. Incredible stuff. And he said, like, I love it. I think it should be 20% longer, 20% funnier, and 20% weirder. And I was like, this is my guy. And like what Mark always insisted was, you know, the only way that you're gonna be able to get away with all of like the serious stuff is if you make a fool of yourself constantly. And it has to be funny, right? You know, like you need to just, you know, your narrator is like, you know, he's erudite and whatnot, and he's, you know, has very interesting things to say, but he needs to be kind of a fool sometimes. And he was absolutely right, you know, and the book already had moments of humor, but it became funnier and funnier. And like, I discovered that I love that, and that I actually want to write funny books, you know? And again, I think that that's also a very kind of like, you know, a Hispanophone tradition, right? Don Quixote is extremely funny. And I think a novel without humor is just a worse novel than a novel with a lot of humor. And then, you know, they let me do whatever I wanted, which was incredible. The book has untranslated passages in 9 languages. Amharic, Zapotec, Yucatec Maya, Nahuatl, French, German, a lot of Spanish, about 20% of text in Spanish. Which ones am I missing? Anyway, there's a bunch of them, right? Old English, Old Occitan. I think that's it. But you know, and they were like, yeah, no problem. I was like, really? And they were like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. You know, it's your book. And so I am incredibly grateful to Soho Press and to Mark Doughton, my editor, and to my agent, Elias Altman, all of whom essentially told me like, we like your writing and you can do it, you know, do what you want. And so I feel that I won the lottery, honestly, because I was really worried that I was going to have to like produce something much more conventional and digestible and approachable. I also like to think that it's actually quite fun, but who knows? Maybe it's boring. Yeah, but it was wonderful actually. After the initial sort of like, oh my God, nobody wants my book. I should like, well, it's a good thing that I'm a journalist now, I guess. It's maybe what I was meant to do all wrong. But then it turned out great, and I couldn't be happier with the publishing process. So I will say, like for those of you here who are writers, who are in the MFA program or undergrad and whatnot, it is actually possible, miraculously, to find little corners of the American literary world that are actually concerned with literature. So, yeah, great.
Thank you so much, and thanks for mentioning Prairie Lights.
Of course. No, I mean, I like this is I spent so much time here, and like a bunch of really important scenes take place in this place. So so thank you very much for having me. It really means the world.
Thank you.